Let me tell you about, this is like one of those times on the show where I don't want to say this, but I think it might be helpful. So my mother's significant other, he's like 80. He's very conservative. And we spent a lot of time in the last decade arguing. But, great opponent, very, good listener, never calls me names. But especially early on in our conflicts, he found a lot of my positions to be very offensive. He was born in the 30s. So, he went through elementary school in the United States with a German last name. He used to get chased home from school during World War II. Saw the Cold War from the day it started until the day it ended. And he was also a professional basketball player. So I think in the 60s or 70s, he was one of these sports goodwill ambassadors that went behind the Iron Curtain in some attempt to build, cultural relations with the Soviets. So he saw a lot of shit, saw a lot of suffering, had a lot of perspective. And as I explained to him a lot of my views without really, really giving him, just because, maybe I wasn't doing my best to communicate the philosophy of liberty, or maybe just the format of the conversation didn't really allow me to do that, because he's usually like framed within the issues of the day. His take on most of the things that I was saying about society, about government, he was like, you sound like one of these radical leftists from the 60s. But I'm pretty sure that I was articulating, in my mind, very clearly, like libertarian positions on the issues that we were discussing. But he said, you sound like one of these radicals, one of these people who just wanted to burn everything down. And because he didn't understand the philosophy, he interpreted my opposition to like cultural norms and tradition as a kind of nihilism. And I remember he said to me, this is like leading up to the thing that I didn't want to say on the show. He said, this fundamentalist individualism that you cherish and you practice is a luxury that's afforded to you by, ironically, the cooperation of people who came before you. And I said, you statist collectivist, what a bunch of bullshit. Like, I've never heard this before. Like, they don't tell us this in 5th grade social studies class. Good men died for your right to say that. So yeah, I reacted to that kind of negatively. But there's a difference between collectivism and community. There's a difference between collectivism and cooperation. The community and the cooperation, we need those things to survive. If you're a millennial and you're listening to this, maybe you've grown up in a world. This might even be true for me. At least the world since I was, 18, 19 years old. We really don't have much respect for community and cooperation. We have the opportunity to flee from the real world, to, just outright online escapes or, echo chambers. I've lived in places for years without knowing one of my neighbors, like in close proximity to hundreds of people without knowing one of my neighbors. I grew up in this little town in New Hampshire in the 1980s. That was very homogeneous. I'm sorry, I know this is controversial, but homogeneity builds trust. I'm not saying it's the only way to have trust in society, but that's kind of how things have worked until now. And we look at how divided, this is a series about political thinking. And we see that things have never been so polarized between left and right. And a lot of us are, on the outside of that, either laughing at the whole thing or maybe trying to make sense of it, maybe trying to learn something from it, hopefully. And even though that seems so front and center because of the way information travels in this world and the way people interface with that information, but in the world I grew up in, that was all secondary. And I remember my dad was a conservative. He became the chairman of the school board when I was in elementary school. He would go to the meetings and be like, yeah, maybe like we should have merit-based pay for teachers because if we just stick to this automatic raise schedule, we're going to wind up with the worst teachers being completely entrenched and the highest paid. And, a lot of people in the town who were more left-leaning would get very angry with him. And I remember the disagreements. I remember neighborhood gatherings, listening to these guys kind of talk loudly about these things with each other. But then, maybe not the same day, but in the same childhood, they'd all grab their tool belts and they'd go build an addition on the town library. Cooperation mattered. And I had it was far from perfect. We've talked about that in a whole series on the show before. Far from harmonious, far from therapeutic, living with two parents who most of my childhood didn't really seem to like each other that much. But what I've done in the past is say they're all bad, all shit, all trauma that needs to be recovered from. Completely failing to embrace or appreciate the opportunities that came from being raised that way. When my father took, me and my baby brother and my mother and moved to this nice, quiet, suburban town into a development from this crime-ridden town in Pennsylvania, Reading, that was basically run by the mafia. It created new opportunities. I had great friends growing up. I was safe to explore. And people prioritized togetherness and building something together over arbitrary divisions in areas of their life where they had no control. I guess, perhaps in part, because we didn't have the technology yet to realize that these divisions and the drama they create could be an almost constant form of entertainment. And we also didn't realize, because we didn't have the technology, that it's fine these divisions exist, because one day you can just be like a virtual observer of the real world without actually having to live in it. But I've devoted a lot of time on this show pursuing and pointing out injustice and missing opportunities for gratitude. And as I get older and I reflect on more and more of my experiences growing up with less negativity and resentment and more forgiveness, those opportunities start to present themselves. And so when I almost bit this poor old man's head off, as part of my reaction to what I think he mischaracterized as this kind of leisure class intellectualizing that I have the luxury to do, but I don't appreciate. I don't think he was asking me to pledge allegiance to a flag and appreciate people who died in the Civil War. I think he was saying that not all tradition is shit. Not everything you see around you is something that needs to be or deserves to be destroyed, because you can look at it through the lens of some ideology and attach some kind of negativity or trauma to it. In other words, I guess, in my own words, if I look out at the world and I wish that things were different, I'd probably be better served to see myself as a part of an evolutionary process than a singular destructive force. It's a nice exercise in the openness to what is, but it's also nice when it shows up in your interactions with other people. That not every political or philosophical conversation, especially the ones that take place online, need to be like all, gotcha, bitch. And also, at least in appearances, it puts a safe amount of distance between me and a lot of the people we talked about on this show today. And frankly, I like that.